And now let's direct our attention to the concept of the literary context of Daniel. Daniel is famous for presenting apocalyptic prophecy. This is a little different style of prophecy, a different genre than what we find in most of the prophetic books. To get acquainted with the apocalyptic genre, I'd like to draw from the Old Testament survey, in particular, the summary of features that characterize apocalyptic prophecy. It shows up on page 409 in association with the Zechariah material. And so Old Testament survey lists the following. First, apocalyptic prophecy often gives us a view of heavenly events. Not so much what's going on the earth, but particular heavenly events. Now, these may have close correlation to earthly activities, but it's at a heavenly level. The writer, the prophet, may be taken up into heaven to view things from that perspective. Oftentimes, there's a supernatural being, an angelic mediator, who will serve in a sense as a host, a guide, and sometimes an interpreter of the events to which the prophet is given a view. Oftentimes we'll encounter symbolic imagery. Sometimes the symbols are clear. Sometimes they're obscure, so that the prophets, in the case of Daniel and Zechariah, they actually ask of their angelic mediators, what does this mean? I've seen this, but I don't understand it. Another feature is the periodization of history. What we have in mind here is that broad segments of human history in apocalyptic prophecy are broken into broad periods, into segments, such as perhaps the final battle, or the establishment of the kingdom of God, or the resurrection of the dead, or end-time judgment, broad periods. The end-time solution. Oftentimes, and generally, apocalyptic prophecy anticipates that the solution, when finally justice reigns, the resolution of the conflicts and injustice, this will take place at the end of human history, not sometime in the middle. An end-time solution, then. Here is perhaps the most useful piece in this brief overview of apocalyptic prophecy. The purpose of apocalyptic prophecy: to comfort God's people who are undergoing persecution, to comfort God's people who are, at the moment, undergoing persecution. The recognition of this as the purpose of apocalyptic prophecy stands over against understanding the purpose of this prophecy as giving a timeline. So rather than seeing it as somehow a calendar in which we can turn over year by year and know exactly where and locate where we are, or how soon future events, recognition of the purpose that you see on the screen before you acts as a deterrent or a caution, and says instead, please consider that the primary purpose of apocalyptic prophecy may rather be to give comfort. And this is saying we should not feel obliged to fit everything into a fairly precise chronological package, but rather say, look at the sum total, look at where it's going. It's going towards an end where God is supreme and He cares for His people, and the impact of that is to issue a message of comfort to those undergoing persecution. Now, as far as where we find apocalyptic prophecy within the Christian Bible, Old and New Testament combined, only Daniel is considered by scholars to present apocalyptic prophecy in its fullest form, its most fully developed form. In the New Testament, we find revelation with fully developed apocalyptic. Daniel is the only one in the Hebrew Bible that provides fully developed, very robust apocalyptic prophecies. Other places where we encounter apocalyptic prophecy within the Hebrew Bible would be Ezekiel, and you see the chapters given there, Isaiah, chapter 3 of Joel, and portions of Zechariah. But Daniel remains the index, the place that we calibrate all other apocalyptic prophecies from, because it's the most fully developed. So then let's examine apocalyptic prophecy within Daniel. We find a message of comfort being issued, and this appears not only in the prophetic material 7 through 12, but in Daniel 1 through 6. There's a strong message of comfort as we see Daniel and at times his friends, his Jewish friends, undergoing distress and finding God taking care of them through that. That issues a strong message of comfort to anyone else who is experiencing similar persecution. Perseverance is another message conveyed by Daniel. Daniel and his friends persevere, and that provides an example to us. Also, there's a statement, and now I'm thinking specifically of chapter 11, verse 33. There's a statement that in the future, some of those who are described as wise, and these are ones clearly allied with God, some of them will fall by the sword, or they will be burned, or they will be captured, or plundered. And the connotation there is how important it is to persevere even in the face of such deadly opposition. To persevere is highly regarded. Third, the future is bound up with God. It cannot be thwarted. That's to say that the future cannot be switched. It's safe with God. It's immutable. Even though someone may be at present undergoing severe or mortal suffering, that does not negate the fact that God still has the final outcome safely in His control. Fourth, the future is hidden or sealed. And this explains why at certain points in these prophecies, they frankly are inscrutable. We do not understand them. Specifically, this shows up in chapter 12, verse 4. But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. Notice the sealing of those words. The same chapter, 12, picking up with verse 8. I heard, Daniel writes, but I did not understand, so I asked, my Lord, what will be the outcome of all this? He replied, go your way, Daniel, because the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. So once again, even within the document itself, reference to the words being sealed. We find within the message of Daniel a focus on the ultimate purpose of God. This goes by the term teleology, from the Greek word telos, which means complete or perfect, or the ending. God's ultimate purpose is the primary focus of this book. Let's consider now how Daniel got his message across. It's significant to observe that, frankly, we do not have what we found in other books known as prophetic oracles, which is analogous to a sermon. Classic case that comes to mind is in Jeremiah chapter 7, the temple sermon. There he is addressing his audience, which are leaders and commoners within Jerusalem. He's standing on the Jerusalem, on the temple precincts, and he's saying, folks, you've got it wrong. You've put too much stock in this temple as an architectural location and a place of religious ceremony. You're engaged with the exterior, but the interior of your lives spiritually is hollow. That's a sermon. It's a prophetic oracle. We do not find Daniel sitting down and addressing, indicting people, as so often was the case with other prophets. It's simply not there. That's what we mean when we say it's absent prophetic oracles. Instead, what we find are biographical narratives and apocalyptic prophecy. Biographical narratives, which eventually were written down, and interestingly enough, are cast in the third person, referring to Daniel as a figure at a distance, in a sense, rather than first-person I statements. In contrast, the apocalyptic prophecies, Daniel is routinely reporting these in first person. Then I saw this, not then Daniel saw such and such. So that briefly helps us to appreciate the modes of communication. Notice we also do not have these dramatic sermons, as we found with some such as Ezekiel or Jeremiah. Certainly we have Daniel engaged in events, but they're biographical. He is not told to perform some certain action which would be symbolic. Things just happen to him, like being thrown in the den of lions or his friends being thrown into a furnace. It's not the same as a dramatic sermon. Those are biographical narratives. Now we're ready to consider the theological context for the book of Daniel. We'll begin by looking at the principal messages which we find arising from this rich book. First, God sovereignly rules over kingdoms. Chapter 5, verse 21 brings this out. Notice also how briefly the messenger summarizes the interpretation of Daniel's personal dream when we come to chapter 7. Daniel has this vision, this dream of 4 various animals, and at that point he asks the angelic mediator, what's this all about? Chapter 7, verse 17 and 18 is where the angelic mediator gives his summary response. I find this is particularly helpful for us to understand the principal message of the book. Quote, the 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. And that's all he says. Wait, weren't there 4 beasts? Aren't you going to tell me about them? And it wasn't the last one especially ferocious. Daniel actually goes and asks for a follow-up, further explication of the dream. But initially, and I think this is so helpful for us to grasp, the first answer, and frankly, had Daniel not probed further, the mediator, the angelic mediator, was presenting this initial answer as an adequate answer. All right, there's going to be these 4 kingdoms that come up. There they are. But get this, the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom. That means they will surface as finally in control. They will receive it from God. And they'll possess it, and there'll be no stopping their possession of it. It'll be forever. And just to drive that point home, yes, forever and ever. There, in summary form, is the principal message. Summarized also in chapter 5, God sovereignly rules over the kingdoms. Although we may not sort out all the details, we too may benefit from this summary interpretation. Several rulers will compete for power, but God will win permanently, and he will share his victory with his followers. I appreciate what Bullock has written on page 298 of his book on the prophets. And I quote, the book of Daniel, written as the exile was fading into the historical past, was the greatest prophetic declaration of the sovereignty of God. It was no longer a theoretical matter, but rather it had been manifested in the great events of history. First, The Lord brought Judah to his knees at the hands of the Babylonians, and those Babylonians were chosen and used as his instrument of judgment. Second, the Babylonians had been wrestled to the ground by the sovereign work of God in history, and the new age predicted by Jeremiah was dawning. And so we point out here that God foreknows all political outcomes. Habakkuk was another who indicated that on the one hand, Judah will be punished, and will be punished by an entity more wicked than herself. And you may recall that this Habakkuk experienced real consternation. He said, how is this fair? And then God responded, well, Babylon is not going to get off free. In turn, Babylon will be punished, and that, we find out, will be by the Persians. Within the account of Daniel, we see these predictions actually coming to pass. And so, we find demonstrated that God sovereignly rules over kingdoms. And now let's go to the theological context, and I invite you to consider the attributes of God that are particularly highlighted within the book of Daniel. First, God is portrayed in no uncertain terms as sovereign ruler. Listen to chapter 2, verse 21. Describing God, it reads, He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. So clearly, God is attributed as having the power and skill to take kings or presidents or you fill in whatever sort of ruler you want to describe, either taking them out of commission, taking them out of their leadership role, or setting them up. God is so sovereign over that, according to the prophecies of Daniel. Chapter 2, verse 47. And now these are the words of Nebuchadnezzar, reporting his assessment of the capacity of the God of Daniel. The king said to Daniel, Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings. So he's sovereign, in charge in that fashion. Next we find, both in chapter 2, verse 29, and again in chapter 2, 47, God is described particularly as the revealer of mysteries. Within this context, Nebuchadnezzar has had a very troubling dream, a dream concerning this enormous statue made of various commodities, particularly a variety of metals. And he's been upset because he doesn't understand what it is. It is to him a mystery. What is the meaning of this statue? When Daniel is summoned and able to explain what these various component metals refer to, namely successive kingdoms, then God is identified as the source of this information and shown to be the one capable of revealing mysteries, explaining the troubling puzzle. So verse 29 reads, As for you, O king, Daniel is speaking, while on your bed your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. So God is revealing the mystery of this puzzling dream, and at the same time revealing the mystery of what will take place in the future. Verse 47 confirms these elements, and now it's the words of the king bringing the message back to Daniel, saying, Surely your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. God is also described by the term Ancient of Days in chapter 7, verse 9 in particular. Daniel reports, As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one, as it's described in New Revised Standard, or other versions render it, the Ancient of Days, took his throne. Notice how he is here again portrayed as sovereign ruler. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. That's interesting. Does that remind you of some other prophecy? A throne with wheels and burning fire? Sounds a lot like what Ezekiel saw in chapter 1 of his book. Also, if you're familiar with the Revelation closing out the New Testament, this resembles a great deal the portrayal that John gives us of what he saw in the heavenlies. As Daniel is describing the experience of an earlier leader who was driven from his position of being emperor or king over Babylon and then later restored. It's almost a period of insanity that seems to be described here. It says that once he learned that the Most High God has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals, then he was restored. So we have this little description of God as being the Most High. These then are some of the prominent attributes of God which we find arising within Daniel. Several passages within Daniel we find recurring in a messianic context. And let's take a look at a few of these. Chapter 7, verse 13 reads, "There before me was one like the Son of Man." We find Jesus referring to himself as Son of Man. This figure in Daniel chapter 7 is clearly a supernatural being. It may be Daniel's usage of this term that was prized by Jesus as he described himself as a Son of Man, incarnate. And he comes with the clouds of the heavens, still, chapter 7, verse 13. Revelation 1:7 reads, "Look, he is coming with the clouds." So the descent of the Messiah in full power in that fashion. Daniel is one of the few passages or books in the Old Testament which refers clearly to a resurrection. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. That's Daniel 12:2. It reminds us of a passage in Matthew 25, verse 46. "Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." And earlier we've referred to chapter 11, verse 31. The prediction, "Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation." And now not referring strictly to Antiochus Epiphanes, but looking to the mention in chapter 24 of Matthew, 24:15. The abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, is referred to as yet a pending event in Matthew 24 and the predictions found there. And now in closing, let's turn to the question of application. How could this message, how could the themes of Daniel have been applied by people in his own setting, that ancient era, and by us today? I'll be presenting these as one largely directed at the modern audience, but I trust you'll be able to look through them and see that they're consistent with an application that would have been appropriate for Daniel's own era. And we'll take these both from the biographical and then from the prophetic section of the book. From the biographical, as we watch these heroic accounts of Daniel and his friends remaining faithful to God despite opposition, it would have inspired ancient readers to similarly remain faithful to God even if they found themselves in an occupied situation or displaced or as exiles. Daniel was a model for behaving with both fidelity to God and integrity to principles of living, even though living in a hostile setting. That applies for the ancient context, and it applies today. Daniel is a marvelous example. And the fact that he was a career diplomat, a bureaucrat, he was in secular employment. He was not a priest. He was not a full-time prophet. This can be a marvelous model for people today who are not in some religious ministry but rather in the business world or in the world of politics, perhaps in research or academics, not in full-time religious service. Daniel is a beautiful model for persons today. From the last half of the book, chapters 7 through 12, this sort of application can obtain both for people in the ancient era and today. For those who long to see God's kingdom displace the injustices that are inherent within any world rule of their own day, either back then or today, those persons can take heart, because God is sovereign, and one day He will rule supremely. That's a fact that people in Daniel's own context and early readers could draw comfort from, and it's a fact that people today still are drawing comfort from these. It's observed that persons today who are being persecuted for their faith, they are individuals who tap into books like Daniel with rich understanding and with rich benefit, even more so than persons who may not be undergoing opposition for their faith.